welcome to San Francisco. I'm just thrilled that you're here. I love that my task tonight is to kind of give you an overview of the city so that when you visit all of these sites that you're going to see, you'll have some kind of connection and link to them. I couldn't weave every single one of them in, but I do. If you have questions after the lecture, I do know almost every site that you're visiting. In fact, I wrote the National Historic Landmark report, designation report for the Swedenborgian Church, and it is one of my favorite buildings. But I will not talk about it tonight. With that said, I thank you for having me and sort of forcing me to collect my thoughts to share with you tonight about the varied cultural landscapes, diverse histories, unique building traditions, and remarkable stories of disaster, resilience, recovery, and reinvention that have shaped San Francisco. Tonight, I aspire to lead you through a visual journey and up and down our famous hills through a series of interconnected vignettes. This remarkable panorama by, yes, that's spelled correctly, Edvard Maybridge, is a snapshot in time, the spring of 1878. Situated within the turret of the Mark Hopkins mansion, which was literally across the street from where we sit tonight, Maybridge ingeniously stitched 13 viewpoints from his Nob Hill perch to create this now very celebrated panorama of San Francisco. It captures the city's urbanity before its greatest disaster, the 1906 earthquake, and subsequent, much more damaging fires. If we zoom in a little bit and split it into two rows, we will come back to this panorama multiple times during my talk tonight. But I would like to further explore this section that's marked with the red arrow now. I love this panorama segment because not only is the dirt mound in the foreground that you see here, essentially where we are sitting tonight, where we're seated tonight in Julia Morgan's resurrected Fairmont Hotel. But in this view, we begin to see the urban form of the city, the street grid overlaid on the city's hills, rows of housing marching up steep inclines, vistas of the bay, and Alcatraz before the built out of its famous prison. And here in this view, you can only see the early lighthouse, which was just visible from Nob Hill. So this is Alcatraz, and there's just a couple little buildings, including the lighthouse. One of the greatest treasures of UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library is this remarkable 1776 Spanish nautical chart delineated in ink and watercolor. This is one of the first depictions of the bay's natural features, including an island called Alcatraz, conveniently marked with the X. We'll commence tonight's story on Alcatraz, and we'll weave our way through time and the city's multi-layered history and geography. We obviously can't cover it all, but I hope that this will whet your appetite for the crazy smorgasbord that is San Francisco history. The week before Thanksgiving 1969, a group of about 90 men, women, and children, referring to themselves as Indians of all tribes, began a 19-month occupation of the abandoned Alcatraz prison. Vacant since 1963, the Bureau of Prisons had decided the cost and logistics of operating a prison on the island were untenable. The Rock, as it has become known, was a flashpoint for American Indians who viewed the island as a symbol of federal apathy towards their struggle and resilience that had shaped their community. It's hard not to notice that even during this moment of planned civil disobedience, the Native American community was overshadowed by other news of the day, here sharing the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle with the Apollo 12 mission. The occupation group leader, Richard Oakes, was aware of the Native people's spiritual connection to the ancient island, but also knew that Native Americans had been incarcerated on Alcatraz. The island had become home to Union troops in 1859, assisting the manning of the lighthouse a few years earlier, And then later, during the Civil War era, Alcatraz housed a full garrison with extensive cannon power, tasked with protecting the Golden Gate and all of California's gold from Confederate ships. In 1895, 19 members of the Arizona Hopi tribe were sent to California and imprisoned on Alcatraz for resisting the policies of forced education at boarding schools and protesting unfair practices of land allotment. This was the beginning of Alcatraz's infamous use as a prison. This painful history and the island's vacancy further motivated the Native community to return to Alcatraz. Ignoring warnings that their occupation was illegal, the group took over the old warden's house and the guards' quarters. They began a campaign of graffitied messages, including on the island's highly visible water tower. Peace and freedom, welcome, home of the free, Indian land were just a few of the graffitied slogans scattered around the island. The prolonged siege began to fray the nerves of everyone involved, and on January 5th, 1970, disaster struck when Leader Oakes's 13-year-old stepdaughter fell to her death. And then shortly thereafter, a fire destroyed several historic buildings on the island, and calls for disbanding the occupation intensified. The Alcatraz siege, set amidst the national strife over the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, emphasized the plight of the American Indian and ultimately influenced change. Recently, the National Park Service restored the graffiti to the water tower to bolster Native American interpretive programs, telling the mostly unknown story of the Indian occupation of Alcatraz to the island's 1.5 million tourist visitors per year. A recurring theme in San Francisco's history is one of disaster or accident, followed by determined recovery and focused resilience, integrated with an almost manic need for the constant reinvention and innovation that many groups and cultures, for the many groups and cultures who have shaped our city. For instance, if we dig a little deeper into the story of this important 1776 map delineation, we find that the Spanish sent both a land contingent and a sea-bearing legation traveling from Mexico. Extraordinarily, while an accidental pistol shot wound to his foot prevented the expedition's primary delineator or cartographer from his planned duties, a capable shipmate and 10 other determined crew members spent over a month exploring the bay, creating this detailed chart. Depicting not only an island called Alcatraz, they documented nearby Angel Island, which would later become basically the West Coast version of Ellis Island with an immigration station, and the newly established land sites at the Presidio of San Francisco, indicated by the number 1 in the detailed map, and the Spanish Mission, noted by number 2. Both sites had been staked out by the Spanish overland contingent. These events would further impact the native peoples and cultures of the Bay, something emphasized by the Alcatraz occupiers 200 years later. Yesterday, some of you got a taste of the incredible collection of David Rumsey, now housed at Stanford. Our understanding and visual connection to the past has been so enhanced by this archive. This colored lithograph, titled View of San Francisco, formerly Yerba Buena, illustrates the outpost beginnings of San Francisco's urban form. A small grid etched into the hills above the bay. Delineated by Captain Swazi, this legend notes that it was, quote, a faithful and accurate representation of San Francisco as it really appeared in March 1847. I don't know, I have my doubts, but. If we zoom in a little bit in this view, we see the critical early connection between the Spanish military post at the Presidio, which was over here, and this little arrow, which on the key points to the Presidio, and over here, this little arrow, which points to the Mission Dolores. So this road became very important to the early days of the city, and it crossed the city, which was now just a town, and crossed right in front of what has become known as Portsmouth Square. And you can see here in Portsmouth Square, this number 1, oh gosh, this goes into the mirror. This number 1 was the customs house at the time. Just a year later, William Hutton, a surveyor and engineer, produced this watercolor and pencil drawing from the City Hotel, which was situated on the south side of Portsmouth Square. He simply called it the Plaza. Despite drastic transformation, which we'll come back to later, Portsmouth Square remains today a public park in the heart of the city. With the discovery of gold came rapid urbanization of what had been the simple Bayside hamlet. This scene illustrates the frenzied confluence of cultures, American and Chinese miners seeking gold, Native American inhabitants intermingling with these newcomers, and Spanish and Mexican settlers. And you can see from this view that the hundreds of ships that were docked in the harbor that brought miners to San Francisco. In fact, there's almost as many ships as buildings in this view. If we zoom in, we see a developing city around what had become called Portsmouth Square. Usually present in these early depictions of Portsmouth Square is the flagpole, which you can see here. One can't talk about San Francisco's history without mention of the great earthquake and fire of 1906, but the early city was plagued by 6 considerable fires between Christmas Eve, 1849, and the summer solstice in June of 1851, each followed by a period of frenetic and more intense rebuilding. Apparently, this was the greatest number of fires in an American city in such a confined time frame. These fires were fueled by a city that was made of highly combustible, densely packed wood frame buildings. And here you see this view of May 1851, which claims losses of $20 million, a huge sum at that moment. The last of the 6 fires occurred in June 1851, and this view was taken from the top of California Street, almost at the spot where we are tonight, and you can see that flag in Portsmouth Square and the buildings that had come to face the square. The following year, so positive were the leaders of San Francisco in their future that the city grid had been established with parcels even laid out into the bay mud with speculative investment expected. Market Street had been established, so this is sorry, I'm gonna have to step around here to do this. Here's our Market Street. Here's about where we are today, and this is California Street running up and down. Market Street had been established as the city's commercial central link and is clearly visible in the city's distinctive grid, which shifts dramatically between the south and the north portions of Market Street, which is still very evident today. Laid into the grid by this time are 2 additional public squares that would become Union Square and Washington Square. And here we see Portsmouth Square down here. Portsmouth Square, and then what became Washington Square and Union Square. This view from about 1851 shows Portsmouth Square with a simple wood fence surrounded by what at the time were a gambling hall, a theater, and a hotel. These early buildings were focused on serving the influx of miners that came to San Francisco. So quickly had the city grown by 1856, just a few years later, that Portsmouth Square had acquired an actual landscape design, fencing, formal entry, decorative pathways, and tree plantings. The buildings we saw in the previous slide would be along this front of the square. Then, just a decade later, by 1866, we see the transformation from this gathering point for transient gold miners to a town center, with this central building that had been a theater converted to the city hall. The 2 other buildings, the former gambling hall and hotel, were also transformed to serve all San Franciscans. These conversions are an early example of the required creative necessity in such a rapidly growing city. One of the other earliest examples of San Francisco's innovative streak was the adaptive reuse of wooden ships for buildings. In this illustration of the practice, the Hotel Niantic here, and another unnamed ship found new uses for their giant hulls, and then not so makeshift vertical additions sprouting from their decks. These novelties, which sat near Clay and Sansom streets in what is now the financial district, were recounted by an Englishman, Frank Muriat, in his 1855 publication. In this 1859 United States Coast Survey map, the delineator actually illustrated the decorative pathways that were found in Portsmouth Square, with the heavy black areas denoting existing structures within each block. You can begin to see the extent of development throughout the city. Important wharves are shown, hill contours are drawn, Russian and Telegraph Hills are named, and both Union and Washington Squares are indicated. The city was truly beginning to take shape. However, this intense urban expansion was interrupted by a considerable earthquake, not the 1906 earthquake, but an earlier earthquake in 1868. While not nearly as destructive as the later 1906 travesty, this event did not go unnoticed locally or in the national press. I love this photo because these two guys just look absolutely nonchalantly hanging out this window of this building that looks like it's really going to fall down any minute. Their nonchalant attitude is kind of a contrast to the dramatic scenes published by Harper's Weekly just a month later. You can see that in this photo, that the photo inspired the sketch that was later published. So you can see that this is supposed to be this, but they didn't put the guys in the window over here. Oops. Another moment in time photograph. Here in Promontory, Utah in 1869, where east meets west on the Transcontinental Railroad. This is an event that would have tremendous impact on San Francisco. It would further the flow of immigrants into the city, bring Civil War veterans and their families westward at great pace. It would quicken shipments from Eastern and Midwestern markets and distributors, and it would raise the ability to ship California lumber and other commodities eastward. In sum, it would mean that one could travel from New York to San Francisco in less than 1 week, which at that moment was truly remarkable. Additionally, the many Chinese workers who had worked on the railroads would stream into San Francisco looking for employment, now that the east and west lines were connected. Indeed, this view, very aptly titled Chinese Laying Last Rail, foretells that story. While a thriving Chinatown had developed in San Francisco, the 1870s saw a huge increase in Chinese population. Oh, sorry, did I go too far? There's that picture, and here's our map. Let's spring forward 6 years to 1875. Just 6 years later, after the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, to another iconic view of San Francisco. It's not Muybridge's photography skills, but a bird's eye delineator capturing a modern city just 3 years before Muybridge's famous panorama. This view, like Muybridge's more realistic scene, helps us tell the story of the places, institutions, neighborhoods, and cultural groups that would remain and that we can still see today in San Francisco. The red arrows point to the Presidio Parade Ground and its environs, which you will visit during your time here, and to the Spanish Mission Church, whose neighborhood had adopted the name, the Mission. The blue arrow is our approximate location today on Nob Hill, and the green arrow points to the trees in Portsmouth Square. Like Muybridge's panorama, we'll come back to this view several additional times to gauge our evolving city. For instance, if we zoom in to this bird's eye view, we can see one of San Francisco's most distinct neighborhoods had developed around Portsmouth Square, the city's established and earliest civic hub. On the left, a picture slightly later of a Chinatown alley during the 1890s, but this gives you a sense of the dense neighborhood prior to the 1906 disaster. This 1885 map of Chinatown, produced for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors by a specifically appointed committee, marks the varying uses, legal and otherwise, that were concentrated in this 12-block area. The illegal gambling halls, houses of both Chinese and white prostitution, the opium dens, all depicted on the map. It showed a joss house or a temple. Oops, sorry, I knew I was going to do that at some point. do the pointer, a Joss House right here facing Portsmouth Square. A Joss House was a temple or a place of worship for the Chinese. This map by the city government illustrates the close scrutiny of the Chinese community at this moment. It's important to remember that along this edge, do that again, this edge of Portsmouth Square was where those buildings were that I showed you that had been converted from the hotel and the theater to basically city buildings. The 1906 earthquake and fire afforded a convenient excuse by city officials to further long-standing anti-Chinese sentiment and claim Chinatown for profitable commercial development. The estimated 15,000 Chinese living in San Francisco's Chinatown lost everything in that disastrous event, forcing many to relocate to other cities, including Oakland. Others were forced to a camp in the Presidio, the only segregated group of camps that sprung up across the city. Indeed, you see here Portsmouth Square with a temporary camp where Chinese were not allowed. The square also became a makeshift graveyard and an even open-air newspaper office for this innovative writer, clearly working on a deadline, sitting right in front of these marked graves. Oops, I think I did that wrong. Between 1875 and 1900, there was a migration of civic and government uses from Portsmouth Square. The federal presence at the Presidio and Fort Point, as well as Black Point, later at Fort Mason, also in the Bay at Alcatraz and Goat Islands, where there were still garrisons, as well as the U.S. Branch Mint. And so here, this was the Mint. This was Portsmouth Square, and we see that a new city hall gets erected quite a distance away from Portsmouth Square. So the Mint, formal designs were made by the Treasury architect, Alfred B. Mullett. Many of you might be familiar with his work. Additionally, a new home for the city's government was erected at this time. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back one. Where the red arrow is, which was the new city hall. The Mint constructed one block south of Market. So remember, Market is that diagonal street, and the grids come together and they don't match. One block south of Market was a stone fortress with a pedimented classical facade. Its distinctive chimneys were landmarks in the low-scale city. On this map, you can see where the Mint is marked. You can see a little pediment there, and you can see the distinctive chimneys. Here, its elegant Greek facade, often called the best of its style in California, as it was photographed in 1883. When the city came crashing down or burned around it in 1906, one of the few landmark buildings to be saved was the Mint. Here you see men on the roof, up there, trying to water down the roof. And indeed, the valiant efforts to save the building and ensure its contents were remarkable. While it was damaged, it was not completely lost like the hundreds of other buildings in the central part of the city. This view of the rear facade really highlights the chimneys which somehow withstood the earthquake. And you can see just the devastation around the building. And you can see the fire approaching the Mint, and these guys just kind of hanging out, watching everything. Some years later, in the 1930s, a new branch of the Mint was built on a hill at the upper end of Market Street, leaving the old Mint without much of a purpose. Fortunately, the Granite Lady, as it is sometimes called, survived a brush with gasp redevelopment, and today the Mint is trying to reinvent itself, and we are hopeful for a city museum in this location that would do much to further the great story of our city. As for the new City Hall, which had been constructed or designed by Augustus Lever, it languished. Like many American cities, San Francisco had its moments of scandal and graft, but the period of the 1880s and 1890s was a particularly active time for political infighting, finger pointing, and even fully illegal activities. Constructing an ambitious and expensive seat of government with shady characters involved just added fuel to the fire. Oops. The building, which also included courts and a hall of records, was finally finished in the late 1890s. Originally designed with a tower, not a dome, architect Frank Shea finished Laver's project at a total cost of $6 million, with one contemporary critic describing it as a cyclops of a city hall, covering 6 3/4 acres. But alas, its life was short. Damaged beyond repair by both the initial structural collapse in 1906, the building burned along with a huge area of the city in April of that year. There was much discussion in the aftermath of how poorly the building performed, especially when compared to the Mint. The rebuilding of San Francisco afforded the city an opportunity to completely rethink its civic center. Here you see John Galen Howard's proposed plan, some of which was implemented. Heavily influenced by the reigning architectural movement known as the City Beautiful, architects Bakewell and Brown realized Howard's vision for a new domed city hall. In the aftermath of the earthquake, San Francisco invited the world to its dramatic unveiling, not just of its new civic center, but new residential neighborhoods and a new commercial metropolis, all to be celebrated in grand style at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. Much was made in the press, locally, nationally, and internationally, about San Francisco's rise like a phoenix from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake. And this was the official poster of the exposition. Located adjacent to the Presidio, some distance from the Civic Center, the fairgrounds were nestled along the waterfront between the Presidio and Fort Mason. So between the two federal properties, the Presidio over here and what was called Fort Mason over here. The fair buildings were grand and magical, but they were not constructed of permanent materials. They were illusions in plaster of Paris. Hugely successful, the fair brought 18 million visitors to the city, but it was never intended to be a permanent feature of the city. The one remnant that survived the fair for decades later was architect Bernard Maybeck's elegant Palace of Fine Arts that was both a sort of forefront sculpture as well that sort of sat in front of the exhibition hall for the fair's many international artists that came to display their artwork. It was so beloved that in the 1960s, when it was threatened with demolition, the city rebuilt it in permanent materials, and it remains a city park today. It's really the only, aside from some of the street grid, it's really the only remnant left of the fair and the Civic Center. The Palace of Fine Arts, situated just outside the Presidio and visible from this fun statue of our friend Edward Muybridge, with his camera present here. So if you're over in this part of the city, this area of the Presidio has been converted to a park, and you can look out over the Palace of Fine Arts, and you can visit with our friend who did this amazing panorama. So we'll go back to the panorama. This time we're going to look westward along California Street from Nob Hill to the expanse that would become San Francisco's residential areas within parcels added as part of the Western Addition expansion. So in this photo, we're looking from the Mark Hopkins house, the turret, out. This is California Street. Eventually this site will become Grace Cathedral. This is the park, Huntington Park, and here, this is where we are at the Fairmont. So these three houses in a row are right along here. So this is the this house under construction. Fairmont would be like right down here. Sorry. So here we see this photo of the three grand mansions, James Flood, the closest to us, David Colton's house, and Charles Crocker. The Flood Mansion remains today. When you take your tour of Grace Cathedral, I highly recommend that you walk the site because there's remnants of the fence of the Crocker Mansion still on the site. Oops. Yeah. California Street makes its way westward and intersects with what would become the other great pre-1906 residential boulevard in San Francisco, Van Ness Avenue. Here you see Van Ness on one of its many parade days with its grand buildings, many of them institutions closer to Market Street, and then more residential the further you got, the closer you got to the bay. And here is that view from looking out towards the bay. So this is Angel Island. So this would, Market Street would be down this way. And so the buildings that were closer to Market Street, like the Concordia Club, were much more institutional. And then as you made your way out towards the bay, you would encounter some pretty incredible residential architecture, like these two houses. Sorry, I lost my place. Dynamited to stop the uncontrollable fires that burned in April 1906. There were 3 days of fires, and the U.S. Army that was housed in the Presidio dynamited the buildings on the east side of Van Ness. So over here, if there was anything left, they dynamited it to stop the fire. And you can see Van Ness still is and was a broad boulevard. So the fire did not leap over to this side of Van Ness except in one place. And so these buildings along this side of Van Ness were generally saved. Many of them were reused. So this is the Porter Ashe mansion that we saw in that view earlier. And it became what was a department store that was called the City of Paris. So the city was forced to use the buildings that remained. They were forced to make do with what they had left in terms of the number of buildings that were devastated. And so this shows you the area of the burn area. So it was vastly extensive. You can see that as you get, this is Van Ness Avenue. There is this one period of blocks, a group of blocks where the fire jumped over Van Ness Avenue. So what survived that side of the line, of the fire line? Here we're looking towards Van Ness, and you can see, you're going to visit Alamo Square and visit a lovely home in Alamo Square, but there were equally important and other areas, squares in the city. And so this is Lafayette Square, and you can see looking down toward downtown, and you can see the different fires burning and trying to make their way through to this neighborhood. And you can see it became quite a social event. People watched the fires. And this is what was left after the fires were all put out. This is where we are today. This is the Fairmont. This is the shell of the Fairmont. And these were these three houses that miraculously survived, and several of the houses along the side street also survived. And here they are today. So you can we'll go back. There's those three houses. The one on the left is the most changed, but the two on the right survived the fire. So another great treat of our friend David Rumsey is this 1905 Sanborn map that those of us who research the city use frequently. And the thing I love about this version of the map is that these little penciled numbers on the houses that you see are the water tap numbers. So we can date houses in San Francisco using this method. Again, because everything burned in 1906, the Hall of Records burned, all of the records burned, so we have very little opportunity to to have documentation on individual buildings, but this is one of the things that we're able to use on a great basis. And so this very high definition scan of these 1905 Sanborns are invaluable. The other component, the water tap ledgers, actually survived. Someone had the foresight to remove them from the water offices at the time, from the Spring Valley water offices. So you might have heard about Spring Valley a little bit today on your tour of Filoli. So that was the Bourne family, and they were in charge of giving us our water in San Francisco. And so all of these tap records were miraculously saved as well. So another grouping of buildings, and these were farther away from the fire line, but I think they tell a really interesting story. These were a little grouping of speculative cottages that you can see here on this little alley. And this is what they look like today. Here's the original announcement. We do have this one great record from this period of time, the California Architect and Building News, and often you will get an announcement about a project. And then the other tool that we use frequently are these block book records, which show that this developer, Mr. Taylor, had owned this little grouping of parcels here. And this site has been a landmark site in San Francisco for a very long time. It's actually one of our first landmark groupings. And in doing some research for a project related to understanding Japantown, we came to realize that all of these cottages were occupied by Japanese Americans right before World War II. And so today, there's a little park next to this grouping of cottages, and there's a new plaque that highlights the story of the Issei, the first generation of Japanese Americans that came. And then the photo on the right is a family that was soon to be relocated to an interior camp in 1941. And many of these folks, when they came back, they came back to nothing. The sad part of this whole story of what had been Japantown is that then we created a new Japantown, and maybe you'll get there through redevelopment. And that project then displaced many of the African Americans that were living in that part of the city. So it's this interwoven story of accidents and bad mistakes and poor policy that sort of tell the story of this little grouping. So to sort of come to a conclusion with the house that you will see. We'll come sort of full circle here with this novel residence that's just affectionately called the Octagon House. It was built in 1861 by William McEllery. In the popular shape of the time, there was this obsession with octagonal houses. And there's actually a second house in San Francisco up on Russian Hill that has the same footprint, the octagonal footprint. And both of them survived the 1906 earthquake, and both of them date to the 1860s. But in 1906, this house lost one of its 8 sides. It didn't do so well. So again, this is that 1905 Sanborn map, and the remarkable story of this building is here it is shown. And so, if you know your Sanborn maps, you know that yellow means wood frame and pink means some kind of masonry. So this building did have a masonry foundation, but its upper portion was wood frame, and you can see in the little cupola that's marked here. So the building in the 1960s was just plopped over to the other side of the street. So you can see if we go back, here it is moving. And this property, this piece of property was owned by the Alline sisters, and they bought this property because it was vacant at the time and didn't have a use, and they helped move the building across the street. And this is the Alline sisters property. There's a park there now, Alline Park. The sisters never married. They were spinsters. They left the property to the city, and the city, in all of its wisdom, tore their house down and built a park. So you can't see the house anymore, but there's little remnants of the gardens in the park. But you can see that at the time that this picture was taken, this was across the street The Octagon House was across the street, and you can just see it in this picture. So California's other great photographer of this period, the 1870s, captured this view in the late 1870s, around the time that Muybridge was crafting his great panorama. In this photo, you not only see the Octagon House in its original location here, with its glazed cupola, but you also see Alcatraz with its little, very small lighthouse. It's barely visible. So we're coming full circle. We're coming back to Alcatraz, where we started our story. My family lives around the corner from the Octagon House, and I often find myself thinking that what would Alcatraz have looked like from that glazed cupola? People often ask me if I could go back to a specific time in San Francisco, what would it be? And certainly for me, it would be this era of the Muybridge panorama, that amazing bird's eye view, and the time of this gentleman, Carlton Watkins. This pre-earthquake picture gives us a sense of what sort of the pre-Victorian era of San Francisco would be. In San Francisco, just before the earthquake of 1906, would certainly have been a very interesting urban landscape. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little whirlwind tour through our city, and I hope that it will frame for you what you're going to see in your remaining time here. Thank you.